webinar museum kali ini. Kita berusaha sekali lagi berenang dalam ilmu, dan kita kali ini belajar tentang burial practices yang akan diberikan oleh Rebecca Kinaston. Rebecca adalah teman kami dalam kerjasama penelitian dan antar universitas, dan Becca yang juga akan memberikan contoh-contoh nanti bagaimana burial practices berdasarkan pengalaman-pengalaman dia. Webinar ini akan dipandu oleh Kiki. Kiki adalah yang termuda dari kami di museum yang akan memandu jalannya webinar, jalannya upacara. Becca, thank you again. Silakan Kiki.
Okay, thank you Ibu Tuti for introducing us in Bahasa. So starting from now, I will speak in English, and hopefully all of us can enjoy this webinar. Okay, good morning everyone, and good afternoon for you, Becca. What time is it in New Zealand now?
4 p.m.
4. Okay.
Perfect.
So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to all the participants here. Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. And as for your recall, this is our 5th webinar series. We usually call this with Night at the Museum, but I know it's not night yet in our time, but it's noon in New Zealand time. So yeah, let's just play with it. And today's we already have a really good one, a really good speakers. She's a Dr. Rebecca Kinaston. She's an expert in burial practice, and she will give us lecture about burial practice today entitled with Burial Practice and the Austronesian Expansion through Island Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. First of all, I'd like to introduce our speakers so we can get to know each other better. Dr. Rebecca, she's a bioarchaeologist and also forensic anthropologist. And she's also a researcher fellow in Department of Anatomy at the University of Otago. And she's got her postdoctoral position at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. And she's also a member of various organizations in this world, such as American Association of Physical Anthropology and Paleoanthropology Association, and also Australian Society for Human Biology. About her research interests, she's keen on the specific aspect of research, such as excavation and skeletal and oral health, isotope analysis, diet, and also migration pattern for prehistoric in Pacific Islands. Okay, without further delay, let's just hearing our speakers today, Dr. Rebecca Kingston. Becca, you have 90 minutes to speak, and we all are ears now. Thank you.
Great. Do you want me to share my screen? Because I have a PowerPoint with lots of pictures.
Yes.
Great.
You already a co-host, so just share your screen now.
It says one participant can share at a time. I'm just trying to figure out. Oh, here we go. Yes, I hear. There we go. And let me go.
All right. Great.
Presenter view. Is that good?
Yes, we can see it clearly.
Okay. Can you see me?
Yeah.
Great. I can see.
Maybe you can full screen your presentation.
Yes. Let me presenter view.
At the bottom.
Oh, no. Oh.
Yes. The one. This one.
Perfect. You good? Okay. So hello, thank you, Kiki, and thank you, Professor Kois Bartiati, for inviting me, and Bayuk, I see your co-host. I'm very excited to be able to share this talk with you and some of my research. And I'm talking with you today because I'm collaborating with researchers from Universitas Erlangen. And today I'll be talking about burial practice, and specifically burial practices in the Austronesian expansion through island Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia, and into the Pacific Islands. And this picture on the front is a jar burial from the site of Pine Haka in Eastern Flores. And I'll be talking about this site quite a lot later on as a case study. And it's very pertinent to Indonesia because Pine Haka is one of the best examples of a Austronesian Neolithic burial ground that's ever been discovered. So having that in Indonesia is really special. And Pine Haka is an amazing site because it has every type of burial practice that you can possibly imagine. So it's a perfect case study for understanding burial practice in the field and what this might mean culturally. So first, I'll talk about myself a little bit and how my research fits in with Professor Kois Bardiati and other researchers at Erlanger. And then I'll do a quick overview of human decomposition and also taphonomy. And this is taphonomy is what happens to the bones when they're underground or in the burial environment. Then I will talk about burial practices and what this means culturally and socially. Then a little bit about the Austronesian expansion. So starting around 4,500 years ago, 4,500 years ago, people moved out of Southeast Asia and through island Southeast Asia, both west to Madagascar, but also east into the Pacific Islands, including settling all of island Southeast Asia and Indonesia. And then I'll talk about two case studies of Neolithic Austronesian burial grounds. One of these is the Pine Haka Cemetery in Eastern Flores, that's between 3,000 and 2,000 years old. And the other is the burial ground of Tayuma. And this was found in Vanuatu, and it is a 3,000-year-old cemetery. And I'll discuss the links between these two cemeteries that we can see that there's an Austronesian link from thousands and thousands of miles away between Indonesia and Vanuatu through the burial practices. And then I'll go into a little bit about how burial practices can tell us and what it can tell us about the Austronesian expansion and who were the Austronesians and what their culture and society may have been like. And then if we have time, I'll go a little bit about how to record burial practice or burials in the field if you're in an archaeological situation, and the best way to record the skeletons so you can get the most information about burial practice. But we'll see how we go with time. So my background is that I have done all of my study at the University of Otago. This is in southern New Zealand on the bottom of the South Island. I have a BA with honors in anthropology, focusing on archaeology, and a PhD in bioarchaeology. I've done a postdoc at Otago, but I've also done a postdoc at the Max Planck. And all of my research has really focused on excavating, analyzing, and understanding prehistoric people in the Pacific Islands. And now I've moved out into different areas as well, including working with Tuti, Professor Kois Bardiati in Indonesia, and I also work in Uzbekistan and California. At the moment, I am a research fellow at the University of Otago. And yeah, I'm just continuing my research on all of these sites. There we go. I've got many field seasons excavating human remains under my belt, all throughout the Pacific, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, New Zealand, Indonesia, Uzbekistan. And I also assist with the recovery and reburial of Maori human remains. So this is the indigenous people of New Zealand. I'll go out and help with any skeletons that may be exposed due to coastal erosion or anything like that. And I've worked throughout the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia, in addition to Timor-Leste, East Timor, and throughout Central Asia and America. I've also worked as a forensic anthropologist for the New Zealand Defence Force, and this was excavating, analyzing, and repatriating or sending back soldiers who had died and were buried overseas, New Zealand soldiers. And we use the disaster victim identification protocol for this, and I know this is what my colleagues in Indonesia also use. So my collaborations with Professor Kois Pardiadi and other researchers at Erlangga, we worked together on a site in East Java that we nicknamed Mystery Cave. And also we have a project in the works for re-excavating Pine Haka. A little sticky here. So we've had a recent publication together on a collaboration of looking at tooth ablation. So this is ritual tooth removal in populations or skeletal assemblages from Nusa Tenggara Timur. And this study was focused on looking at the ritual removal of teeth that Tuti and her colleagues have been identifying in a number of assemblages that are curated at the University of Erlangga. And at Pine Haka, we also found that there was tooth ablation there. So we combined our results together and had this recently published in the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology. And right now there is a publication on the ancient DNA of the individuals that are curated from at University of Erlangga from Liang Bua, Liang Togi, and Palindi, and this is under review right now. And there should be hopefully another paper coming up soon. So we've worked on a cave in East Java. And this is a collaboration between Balai Archaeology, Erlangga, Max Planck, and Griffith University. We've had grant success for this. And this was through a Marsden grant from New Zealand. And in 2019, we went to excavate the site, and this was fossil-laden breccia. And there's an example of these fossils at the university in the Museum of Ethnology. And the dating of the site is currently underway. So hopefully we will get what I think will be Pleistocene dates. There was only fauna found, but it's still a very interesting site and a lot of potential there. And this is the example of the breccia in the flowstone that's at the University of Erlangga right now. There's over 72 fossils found, and it's just a very exciting site. And I was very happy to be able to work with it, Professor Kois Pardiadi on this project. And this was one of the most exciting finds, which was a large rhino tooth. So in 2012, I had the opportunity to work on the Pine Haka site, and this was discovered in 2010, and in total there were 48 burials. And we've got a new project going to re-excavate the site between Erlangga, Max Planck, Griffith, and Otago. This was funded by a grant from New Zealand, and we visited Tuti and Inda Asikin from Balai Archaeology Yogyakarta. We went to visit Larantuka, the closest town to the site, in March, right before COVID, and we were almost organized to go, but it didn't work out because of COVID. So I did a forensic workshop, and we secured the research permit. We have the team ready, and we're just waiting to be able to go back and excavate the site. We want to do a full bioarchaeological analysis on any new burials, including sampling for isotopes and ancient DNA. So Burial practices are so important because they can tell us a lot about the culture and identity of past people. So our burial practices, what people put in the graves, but also how they inter or put the person in the ground, tells about religion. As you know, different religions bury people differently. It can also tell us about social relations between people. So it can tell us social status. So if people are richer or poorer than one another. And it might tell us something about family relationships. So if people are buried together in a family plot, then this might be able to be identified. We do this now in modern times. We can look possibly at migration. We can do this through analyzing the material culture, so the objects put in the grave. So if these are local to a site or traded in. And we can also use isotopes and DNA to look at migration. And this is to find if there are any non-local people or people that aren't from that area that are buried there. And this can tell us about intermarriage and migration to new areas. The trade and exchange, if there are any exotic, say, jewelry or stone tools, this can tell us that people are interacting with other communities in different areas. Now, burial practices are very linked with taphonomy. And taphonomy is what happens to the bones when they're in the ground. And by understanding how bones are affected by certain environmental factors, this can help us interpret burial practices and also understand the process of decomposition as well. Taphonomy also has to do with fossilization. So we see fossils, we can, it can help us determine the dates or how old a sample is. And a burial is, in its basic, most simple form for a grave, you've got the grave cut, where someone is dug in, the body is placed, and then there's soil that's filled on top, and that's the fill. So there are usually visual differences and textural, so the actual texture of the soil and color is different in between the fill and the sterile soil that's undug around it. And this is how we can identify a grave cut, by looking at the soil color and texture in the grave compared to outside the grave. The grave fill, the skeleton's inside the grave, and the grave cut is differentiated. Here's an example of grave cuts in a historic cemetery in New Zealand. And these grave cuts are pointed out by the red arrows, and they're the dark soil. And these are just classic coffins here. So in this situation, the sterile soil, or what the graves are dug into, is the lighter clay. And then when the clay is put back into the grave, it's more crumbly, it's softer, and it's a different color. So what we've done in this situation is use an excavator or a digger to scrape off the topsoil that's dark brown, and you get a very clear picture of where exactly the graves are through these color differences of the grave cut. And this is what you'll first see when you're excavating. Once you see a darker patch, usually darker, you know that you might be coming into a grave. So this is very important if you're excavating as an archaeologist. I've had situations where I've been excavating and there's a small oblong cut or color difference, and it actually has turned out to be a baby grave. So really size can tell you about the age or size of the person that's interred in the grave, and it's really important to be slow and careful when you find these types of cuts. Now, human decomposition, there's 5 major stages. The first stage is when the cells in the soft tissue start to break down. This is when you see the rigor mortis. This is when people get stiff, you get the blistering, and in forensic situations, by identifying these different stages, you can see or estimate how long the person has been dead, depending on the environment that they are in. The second stage is gas formation, and this is because the bacteria in the body are creating gases, and the body begins to bloat. You get a lot of skin discoloration and liquid starting to form. Stage 3 is the active decay, and this is when you get the proper liquefaction of the soft tissues, including organs and muscles and skin. And this is when the insects are starting to come in. There's a lot of bacterial activity happening. And then in the advanced decay, this slows down. There's less soft tissue for the bacteria to eat. The insects aren't as interested because there's not as much food, and decomposition slows. And the final stage is the dry remains, so the skeletonization. And when you see that all the soft tissues have decomposed, or in certain dry situations, they may have just desiccated or dried. So there's no more decomposition, but there's still a layer of skin on. And in the archaeological record, this is what we're seeing, is these dry remains, so just the skeletons. And this is because decomposition, when someone is in the soil especially, you get a lot of bacterial action and insect action, and this just leaves the bones. In some situations, as we'll talk about in the next few slides, you may not even have bones. You may just have the remains of the crowns of the teeth. And that's because the tooth enamel is incredibly hard, and it preserves the best in archaeological situations. The dentine, or the softer tissue of the tooth, may be completely gone as well. So bone preservation can vary within the same burial ground and also within the same burial. I've worked on sites where we have a burial that is has a lot of water in it, and tree roots had come into the burial and basically eaten away at all the bones, and all there was left was tree roots that, or small roots that were shaped like bones, where they had gone up into the bones, and there were little buttons just on a bed of roots. And about 3 meters away, there was a perfectly preserved skeleton that still had a wool shirt on, wool socks, hair preserved, and that was because he was buried on a rocky area, and the water had just drained straight through. So it acted to dry his grave. In the burial environment, there's exogenous bacteria, but there's and fungi. So this is the bacteria that come from the soil, bacteria and fungus that come from the soil and act to decompose the soft tissues, but can also decompose the bone. There's endogenous sources of bacteria, and this is the bacteria that are in your stomach. And when you die, they will start to eat a person from the inside out. So there's both bacteria acting on the outside of the body and from the inside going out. And bacteria are really detrimental to bone preservation because they secrete acids that lead to the dissolution of, or they eat the collagen, which is the organic part of the bone. And this leads to a dissolution of the inorganic matter, the appetite, because they secrete acids. So if there is a lot of bacterial action, this can lead to very, very poor bone preservation or no bone preserved at all. There's a number of factors, environmental factors, that really affect bone preservation as well. pH is a huge factor in bone preservation. Highly acidic soils will cause the inorganic matter of the bone to dissolve, and then this allows the bacteria to come in and eat the collagen in the bones. The inorganic matter in bones is kind of what do I want to say here? It's protecting the collagen, and that's what makes bone so dense and strong. And once the inorganic matter is taken away through a highly acidic soil, the bone is very vulnerable to decomposition. Moisture is also a big factor. In very dry environments, bone is preserved well. When moisture comes in, this allows bacterial growth and also the acidity of the soil to come in and permeate the bone. There's post-depositional factors, and by this just means things that can disturb the skeleton or the body after it's buried. So this could be someone digging, but it can also be a burrowing animal, root activity, or something like this. Root activity is especially bad, and we see this a lot in both temperate environments like New Zealand, but also tropical environments. Coconut trees are especially bad. They've got a lot of roots, and they will completely break apart bones if they come near them. We have animal gnawing, and this is a picture. Do we have the animal gnawing here? Animals such as rats, crabs can affect bones as well. There's a lot of different animals. It really depends on the environment and what animals are around. Burrowing animals are especially bad for bone preservation, but also there's certain scavenging animals that will dig and take bones away. And individual skeletal factors are important. So big, thick bones like the femur and the humerus, they preserve better than smaller bones with larger amounts of cancellous or trabecular bone. And that's the spongy bone that's found at the ends of bones here. So this strong cortical bone, you'll find this well preserved, but in other situations, it really depends on the environment that the bone is in. Other tissues can also preserve depending on the burial environment. So in New Zealand, in situations where there's an acidic soil, especially clay that's waterlogged, and this means that there's a lot of water, there's not a lot of drainage, and there are people in coffins, you get the preservation of hair, nails, and brain. And the brain preserves because it forms into a substance called adipocere, and this is known as grave wax also. And this is when anaerobic bacteria, when there's bacteria that don't use oxygen, they break down fat and they create basically a brain-shaped little remain in the grave. So these are quite interesting things that you may come across depending on what the soil type is, what the burial environment is. So this is an example of gnawing. It's very diagnostic. You can see this very easily. You see the teeth marks chewing away at the bone, and it will expose the in the skull the inner table of the cranium. And so it's good to be able to identify gnawing, because this shows that it's different than, say, a burial practice or situation where someone may have been dismembered before death. So you can know that this is an animal and a natural process compared to a human process. Now, burial practices can affect preservation. And this is because by wrapping a body or putting a body in a coffin, this will slow the process of the environment coming in to affect the body. However, there's still the internal bacteria that can move out and degrade the body from that way. The coffin will protect from ground-dwelling insects, so worms, grubs, and also burrowing animals for a long period of time. And it'll especially protect us during those early stages of decomposition that are very important. If those are slowed and not super active, then the bones will be preserved very well. And we haven't gone into the specifics of different burials, but there's primary burials, I'll do that now, and secondary burials. Primary burials are when people are just placed in the ground, it's the whole skeleton, and they are not messed with after that. A secondary burial is when a body has decomposed elsewhere, either in the ground, above the ground, and then bones are taken and placed in a different area. So here we have two examples. One is the skeleton on the right here is a primary burial, although the head is removed. And this person has been wrapped, and we can tell this because the clavicles are vertical and the hips are in articulation. So it was interpreted that this person was likely wrapped before they were put in the ground. There was no coffin, but they were wrapped and put in a grave. On the left, these bones here, this was a bundle burial, we called it, and this was a number of bones that had been taken from somewhere else and placed together in a secondary burial. And sometimes bones from secondary burials are better preserved because they may have been able to be dried in above ground, and so there's not so much insect and bacterial activity, and then they've been placed dry into a grave or into a hole. And so they can maybe, in some circumstances, they're better preserved than a primary burial because they don't have all this bacterial action affecting the soft tissues. And to interpret burial practice, which we'll go into a little bit later, I'll just touch on now, you really need to identify the placement of each bone and record that while you're excavating. And this is why it's so important to excavate carefully, expose the whole skeleton when you're excavating, and take a lot of pictures, because sometimes when you're excavating, you don't notice small things, such as certain positions of bones that will inform you about how a person is buried. Cremations are another burial type, and this has been, cremations have been happening for thousands of years. On this top picture, we've it's a photograph of the burning ghats in India, in Varanasi, and some of the oldest cremated remains have been found in Australia, dating to 30,000 years ago. And we see cremation all over the world. In the Pacific Islands and islands Southeast Asia, we see it used in addition to all these other burial practices as well. So coming across a cremation is a very possible thing when excavating in your area. Cremations can be identified by a conglomeration or a large pile, might be small if it's a child, of burnt bone. And these can be in all different colors. So for cremation, it's best to collect the whole deposit in one, bag it up, record it, and then in the lab, you go through and sort the different sizes and identify the colors of the bone. The color will tell you about the temperature that the body was burned. It's a chemical process, and it involves destroying all the organic matter in the bone, so the collagen in the bone, and the inorganic matter remains. And cremations survive really well in archaeology because the bacteria won't get in to eat the collagen. It's gone already. And this is why cremations are very interesting for people to study, and they will last for thousands and thousands of years. It is very important when excavating to be able to identify a cremation quickly, because it might accidentally be swept away by an inexperienced person. And compact bone in cremations will warp and fracture, but spongy bone, so at the end of your long bones, that type of bone will just shrink, but it will keep its shape. And here we just have there is a reference for this, and this just tells you the colors of bones compared to the temperature that the person was burned at. So as you can see, the lower the temperature, the more color that a cremation will show. But as the temperature increases to what we see in today's, like a modern cremation, all the bones will be white afterward and powdery if it's at a very high temperature. Coffin burials are common across the world, and I know they have been found in a number of different sites in Indonesia as well. Coffin burials preserve best in either waterlogged or very dry conditions. And the pH needs to be ideal for both the wood and the skeleton to be preserved. I've excavated a number of coffin burials in New Zealand, and because the site was very acidic, acidic clay was the soil type, that the bones were very poorly preserved, but the soft tissues, such as the hair and nails, were present, and the coffins are very well preserved. So it may be that you find a coffin burial, but there's very little skeletal remains inside, really depending on what type of environment the coffin is in. And here we have examples of what coffin burials look like from an aerial view, and also a very well preserved coffin and skeleton. And if you come across or you're excavating a large cemetery with a lot of coffins, it can be great to expose them all at once, depending on how fast you're able to do the excavation. So you get a great aerial view of how the coffins are laid together. And this can tell you possibly about family groups, husbands and wives, and different social and cultural information. So the waterlogged coffin, this is when a coffin will flood at the early stages of decomposition. This example here is a historic burial from New Zealand. So this is in the late Victorian period. This is about 1875. And this man was buried during the autumn. We know this because there was a plaque with his name on. So we know who this was. We know when he died through records, and his coffin was inundated or flooded with water while he was decomposing. And this caused all his bones to jumble around. And this is why you have ribs and vertebrae all over the place here. So this is very interesting. If you see this, then you know that flooding occurred early on during the decomposition period. If this person has already become a skeleton or skeletonized in the grave and then water comes in, usually the bones will be on the bottom and not move around a whole bunch. This is when a body was bobbing up and down in the coffin, and the coffin top hadn't fallen with the weight of the soil. So a very fresh individual, fresh death. So we talked a little about primary burials, and this is when a person is interred their whole skeleton into a grave. Here is an example of a person buried on their right side in Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan had excellent preservation. The pH of the soil was really neutral, and it was incredibly dry and arid. So you didn't get a lot of moisture and bacteria affecting bone decomposition. All the soft tissues were gone, but people were put in very simple graves, sometimes wrapped, sometimes not. And this person, this old woman on the right, the preservation was so good. You had every single finger, phalange, and just exceptional preservation. So when you have a primary burial, you'll want to identify how the person was lying, if they're put on their right side, left side, their back. So this person, we say, is slightly flexed, arms and legs, and interred on their right side with their head facing west. And here is a child burial from the same site. This individual was very close to the female. And we thought at first that they may have been Bronze Age burials because the site was a Bronze Age site. But when we were excavating, we saw a lot of these large sherds of Bronze Age pottery were actually broken and put into the fill. And after some careful consideration, we figured out it was actually a later medieval burial into a Bronze Age site. So in situations where there's very little difference between the soil type of the fill and the sterile soil on the outside, it can take a bit of interpretation to decide what the burial process was. And you can see here there's a stone lining around the grave as well. So that was a part of the burial process. After we got the dates back, we found that these people were medieval, and it was a Muslim burial practice in the area. So here's an example of a Bronze Age skeleton from Germany, and this person has been put into the grave face first. And these prone burials, a lot of times it's interpreted that there's a lack of care. This might have been a murder victim or a sacrifice or something like that. I'm not sure of the exact situation. But as you can see, there's not a lot of care put into the burial. So we can interpret that something traumatic may have happened to this person at the time of death. You can see their legs are also broken here. It looks like they've been crushed into the grave. And here's an example of two medieval skeletons from England. And here we have a prone burial, so another person put face down. But also later, their legs or lower limbs have been disturbed. And this means that by this child burial. So someone dug a hole, found their legs, have put them somewhere else, and then buried a child there. So primary burials, you may see that there's post-depositional processes that may be another grave. And so this is how you can interpret the timing of the burials. So we know that this person would have been buried first because they would have had legs, and then the baby was buried later, the child. This is an example of a disturbed burial. So something has happened that has disturbed a primary burial or the rib cage. This is important to be able to interpret what might have happened by uncovering each bone carefully, photographing. And in some situation I've seen, you can actually see tiny burrows of mice or rats or crabs that can cause this kind of disturbance. Or this may have been someone coming in much later and grave robbing as well. This is an example of a multiple burial. So all these people were buried at one time. You can tell this because they're overlapping. They're within one large grave. You can see the grave cut here. And this can show a very traumatic event. You can also see another person underneath. So there could be layers and layers of people. And this usually means a traumatic event, or there may be a plague, or a time when there's a lot of people dying at once and they need to bury people fast. So secondary burial, I talked about that a little bit. These, the bone bundle that was discussed earlier. We also found at Pine Haka, these are all examples from Pine Haka, there was a lot of manipulation of bodies after a person had been buried at the site. And this Pine Haka site is the one in eastern Flores. And we see a lot of these bone bundles, but we also have found a number of heads that had no postcranial skeleton or no long bones or any other bones. This is just a small piece of scapula. They're heads with no body attached. Jar burials are another type of burial practice that you see a lot through island Southeast Asia and the Pacific and other areas in the world. This is the individual or burial that I had on the cover page, but without the ads there. This was a person that was dismembered and put into a pot. So he was dismembered at the soft tissue stage during decomposition. And I knew this because his hand was still articulated. There were still bones that were articulated together. So the long bones had cuts in different places to put him into the small pot, but the hands were still together. And the hand is one of the first body parts to decompose because there's not a lot of tissue around it. So the hands, if there were just hand bones in with the other bones, I would have interpreted that as him decomposing fully somewhere else and then being put in the pot. But as it was, I think he was cut up while his body still had soft tissue on it and he wasn't fully decomposed. On the right here, we have an example of just a skull in a pot at the Tauma Cemetery. And there were very few skulls found at the site. So all of the individuals, over 100 individuals that were buried at the site in Vanuatu, none of them had heads, yet there were a few examples of just a head in a pot or a head on someone's body at the site. So there was some type of head ritual going on at the site. And here we've got an example of Egyptian primary burials of children in pots. And as you can see, the children are very well preserved because they've been in a dry environment, but also protected by the pot. Now I'm just going to go a little bit into the settlement of island Southeast Asia, so change tact a little bit to give you a little background of the next part of the talk. Island Southeast Asia was first inhabited by early modern humans, Homo sapiens, possibly 70,000 years ago, potentially earlier. And near Oceania, in this region, I mean Papua New Guinea, at least 50,000 years ago. Now, near Oceania, this is Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands. These islands were settled first, 50,000 years ago. Remote Oceania are the islands to the east of the Solomons, and this is Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa. And these islands were only settled 3,500 years ago, or starting around 3,000 years ago, I should say. And this is from people that originated in island Southeast Asia. They had an Austronesian language, and eventually they reached Polynesia or their descendants and settled that area. So island Southeast Asia is a very important mixing pot of both early modern humans. We know also hominids with Homo floresiensis. And I think there's going to be a lot, there's going to be more hominid species being found in the area as well. the Austronesian expansion, whoop, we'll go back, excuse me. The Austronesian expansion was the largest maritime migration in prehistory. So this is the largest boat-faring over ocean movement of people in the world prehistory. People were moving from Madagascar or from island Southeast Asia to Madagascar in the east or in the west, and to the Pacific Islands in the east. And this map here shows the timing, or the proposed timing of settlement of people through island Southeast Asia, or the Austronesian expansion through island Southeast Asia and into the Pacific. And what we need to understand is that the Austronesians were moving into Indonesia and other islands around that were already settled by humans. So they were coming into an already settled place and interacting with these people. They spoke an Austronesian language, but they have varied genetics. And the Austronesian language was almost a lingua franca that allowed them to be so successful. There's really complex interaction spheres. People aren't just going one way, they're also coming back with trade and exchange. There's this pulse around 4,000 years ago, 4,000 to 2,000 years ago, where people are spreading rapidly across the regions. And we can identify the Austronesians in the archaeological record through special material culture, including conus shell rings. Pottery is very important. This is how we can really identify them. This pottery. And we see pottery throughout the Pacific, but in island Southeast Asia, these sites are quite difficult to find, and it might be because of ocean level rise, but also if people are moving quickly around different areas and they are on boats, they're not leaving a lot of evidence behind, and especially evidence of burials. So we don't have a lot of examples of burial grounds of Austronesians in island Southeast Asia. So the Pine Haka site is so important because it is one of the only Austronesian Neolithic open cemeteries that has been found, and it is very well preserved. So Pine Haka here is on the very eastern tip of Flores, near Larantuka. This beautiful pottery with these faces. The site was identified in 2010, excavated formally in 2012, and it was only uncovered because there was a large tsunami in 1992 that destroyed the village that was located directly on top of the prehistoric cemetery. It took off about 1 meter of topsoil, and this allowed archaeologists to find the site because pottery was being exposed. In total, there were 55 interments and 28 burials, and this means that there were some multiple burials, or 2 people in 1 burial. And this was published in Antiquity in 2016. And we hope to return to the site with the team from Erlenga whenever we can, really. There's a material culture that was found at the site. We have beautiful, well-preserved pottery, quadrangular stone adzes, which is a very Austronesian stone or tool type, and also shell jewelry, conus shell jewelry. The burials were dated through radiocarbon dating to between 3,000 and 2,000 years ago. And there is the widest variety of burial positions that I've ever seen in one cemetery or ever heard about, really. Both single and multiple burials. This means 1 person buried, or there was 2 people buried, or there was a series of people buried one on top of the other. There's a secondary burials, like I've shown earlier in the talk, and also, importantly, jar burials. And jar burials seem to be a very iconic expression of Austronesian culture. is burying people in jars. These jars were both spiritually important and culturally important. The burial practices were published in this book here, and I think I have an online or a PDF that I've sent Kiki that she can share. I'll check that. Most of the burials were found in 2 different zones. There was zone 5 that had a large congregation of jar burials, both infants and adults, and some primary burials, or a primary burial. There were also pots without burials in them that were put in the ground near the jar burials. And this is zone 6, and zone 6 had both jar burials, multiple burials, baby burials. There was a huge selection of burials. Oop. These aren't coming up. So we have the secondary jar burial, which I talked about before, which on the previous picture had ads, but it liked to disappear. We had infants in jars, and also we had people primary full skeletons in jars with conus shell arm rings. The primary burials were flexed in different ways. Some were on their right side in fetal position. Some had their legs flexed. Excuse me. And their arms placed up. They were manipulated in all different ways, and there didn't seem to be any common pattern at all in this. We also had burials that they had both of their head removed. So in this situation, this person, oh, excuse me, just one moment. Excuse me. This person on the right was interred first. So this is a person lying supine. So this is on their back, extended. And what you see here is only the thorax, the pelvis, the left leg, and both the arms. Their head had been removed after they'd been buried. And then later, this person was buried right next to them, but they disturbed their lower limbs. And what we can see here is that the lower limbs of the first person were actually put under the thorax of person number 2. And I interpreted that this happened not very far after the time this person was buried. And this is because the toes had been spread across their legs, but their ankles were still articulated. So we see this body manipulation, and they're not worried if they're disturbing another person in this burial ground. And here's another example of this. We have the lower limbs of the first burial underneath the thorax of the second. So what we know is that there's no settlement at Pine Haka. There's no evidence of settlement. There's no midden. There's no trash pile. There's only a burial ground there. And it was in use for almost 1,000 years. They had really, really varied burial practices. We see migration isotopes show a high degree of mobility that are possibly through established maritime trade routes. And we think that Pine Haka may have been a central place where people that are high mobility seafarers are moving around, and then they're burying their dead in this central special place. The burial practices with the pottery stone tools do match other Austronesian cemeteries, which I'll talk about another one in Vanuatu. And this suggests that there may be this pan-regional belief system that we can see that the Austronesians had practiced, and we can really see that expressed through their burial practices and the material culture that was put in the graves. So what we see in this graveyard are the adzes and jewelry as well. Now, Lapita is the name of Austronesian settlers that moved into the Pacific Islands and above Papua New Guinea in these islands called the Bismarck Archipelago. In this area, there was a culture that they developed that had very distinct decorated pottery called Lapita. And this happened around 3,400 years ago, 3,400 years ago. People start making this pottery above Papua New Guinea, and then they spread east into the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, and also as far east as Tonga and Samoa. And so we know this is Lapita people because we can identify that by this beautiful pottery in the archaeological record. The Tauma burial ground is the largest example of a Lapita cemetery in the Pacific Islands. It's dated to about 3,000 years ago. There's 93 individuals. And as I said before, nobody had a head. All the heads were removed after the people were buried. People were buried after a period of decomposition. They were placed in kind of an area, in a hole around coral boulders. You can see these coral boulders. Some people were wrapped, and there was a lot of bone removal. There was clavicles, forearms, and all the heads were removed. And then some heads were then placed either in a pot or in between people's legs or on their chests. The coral boulder and the volcanic ash created a perfect situation for bone preservation. And the bones were just beautifully preserved. And this created a lot of, it was quite dry there. So we see, we don't see this type of excellent preservation in many other sites in the Pacific. And here are some examples of 3 skulls on the lower right, 3 skulls on the chest of a person. And this is just an example of what it was like excavating at the site. Was excavating there in 2008 and 2009. Interestingly, they were also buried with a lot of jewelry, and we have these jar burials, very similar to Pine Haka. And just a fun fact, these types of shells with holes in them have been found at other sites, but archaeologists didn't know what they were. And it wasn't until they were found on a body at Tauma that it was discovered that they were actually links to a bracelet. So what do these Austronesian burial practices tell us about Austronesian people? What we can see in the Pacific at Tauma and some other burial grounds I didn't discuss, but they're similar, and in Southeast Asia, especially the Pine Haka burial ground, we have a large variation in burial practices, jar burials, really similar burial goods, material burial goods, including adze, shell jewelry, importantly, the jar burials. And this really signals that there's some pan-regional or cross-region belief system. And we wouldn't have otherwise known this unless we had these beautiful examples of burials and burial practices. Also importantly, the head removal, bone removal, and manipulation is showing that people have a lot of interaction with the dead. They're not just burying them and leaving them. And we know that these are highly mobile seafaring people. Are they early sea nomads? Just an interesting thought that people have brought up. And their Austronesian language is the culture and belief system tied up with that. So it's just really interesting to be able to see these really direct links where we know Austronesian people moved through island Southeast Asia into the Pacific, but we haven't had any type of evidence to really understand what their culture and social structure was like. And these burial grounds really help us realize what life was like, but also what these people may have believed in. Now I've got a little bit of time left. So I don't know how many people are archaeologists or would like to get into the field, or a bioarchaeologist, but I thought I might give an overview about field work. And this also plays really importantly into how we record how the body is laying, and that will tell us about burial practice. And then the next level is interpreting what this burial practice may be by comparing to other sites in the region. So I've gone over that second part, but now we'll go to the initial part of how do we get a sample of skeletons, and what is the process once we found a site to excavate, or a burial ground to excavate. Now I know Tuti is very experienced in this, so I'll just give a perspective from New Zealand about this. And this also gives my perspective of working in other countries as well. So the first step is to find a research area that you're interested in, and a research team that you can work in. And for me, it's about finding good collaborations with people that I get along with, and that I know we can work together well. And importantly, of course, is to get permissions and research visas, and go through the process, the bureaucratic process to organize excavation. It's important to do a desktop survey across the geological formations. So when maybe that they formed, I know I have friends that work on very early sites, and they look at what the landscape was like thousands of years ago to see if someone could have actually lived there, if that area did exist at the time. So we look at ocean level rise, uplift due to volcanism or volcanoes, things like that. And then also asking the locals, because the local people know the areas the best. And they can tell you what they found, if there's any archaeological material coming up, if they found human bone, and where exactly that was. And, you know, just looking on the ground. So Pine Haka was found because one of the locals came with the archaeologist, and he sat on the ground, and he accidentally sat on the rim of a pot that was eroding from the site, and that's how the site was found. And then you organize your team of experts, students, locals, your collaborators, and plan the excavation together. And this is Professor Kois Bardiati and I went to Larantuka in March 2020, that's right. And we met with the local people, discussed what the excavation would entail and the prices of different things. So this is a very important part. Met the local officials to make sure that it would be an okay thing to do. And then the excavation can commence. And it's important to really get on board with what type of field recording and what your aims and objectives are of the site. And once you excavate the site, there's a lot of washing, drying, packing, or the reburial of the remains at the site, which is what we did last time at Pine Haka, because that was the wishes of the local people. And if you're allowed to take the skeletons away, it is about curating for laboratory research, and then the post-excavation analysis in the lab. So this site here is a site in Vanuatu at the top, where we've been excavating for a number of years, a burial ground. And the burials were at the lower layers here and in the soft sand at the bottom. And here is an example of a burial from Pine Haka as well. So the archaeologists will usually conduct the survey, and then they will call in bioarchaeologists to come in and do the specialist work. This is an example of excavating a historic site in New Zealand, where we luckily have the access to big diggers. Now, like I said before, the most important thing is to get permissions from the local people and the local government, to secure funding, because these can get quite expensive, and also do a really good budget to know what the expenses may be. And then try to understand all the logistical considerations. In Pine Haka, there's no water source and no accommodation, so we had to tent, bring all of our food and water, and then we employed local people to also to cook, work on the site, and health and safety is very important, to make sure that you have trained health and safety people, and also that you have first aid kits on site in case something might go wrong. I know in Pine Haka there were poisonous snakes and scorpions and spiders, so it's just trying to avoid all, or know the risk when you go. And then bringing all the archaeological gear, buckets and shovels and trowels and everything you'll need to do the dig, because there's nowhere to get these when you're on site. And then also the planning for the bioarchaeology, which is a lot more fine tools, recording sheets, sieves, and packing material, and sampling tools to undertake the specialist skeletal excavation. Excavation of human remains is much slower than a normal archaeological excavation. You have to be careful and systematic. And once you find a grave, and this is usually from finding the grave cut, this will hopefully allow you, once you see the difference in the soil between the grave fill and the sterile soil, you'll hopefully be able to see where the outline of the grave is, and then not step on that area. And the head, if someone's lying down, the head and the pelvis will be the highest part in the grave. So you usually find these first. And you go from the known to the unknown. So once you find your head area, you'll excavate the arms and the thorax, and then down. If you find the legs, then go from the legs up or down, to never just dig without knowing what you're digging. There's special excavation tools, which are clay molding tools, small brushes, and the whole time that you are excavating, record what you're seeing, because the skeletons can be very fragile and they may break or be disturbed by an animal or something like that if you leave them overnight. And so it's really important to take photos constantly and record what you're excavating. Drawing, some people like to draw. I'm not a very good drawer, or artist. So I prefer to take photographs and then digitize them later. And here's just an example of Professor Hallie Buckley and my friend Amy Foster excavating on Pine Haka, a multiple burial. And this is a colleague, Fidel, drawing one of the burials in Vanuatu. And here we have another colleague in Uzbekistan drawing one of the graves there, one of the burials. So for drawing, it's good to put a scale next to the burial so you can get a true representation of the size of each limb and bone. So here are some excavation examples. On the far left is a tiny, tiny baby that's 3,000 years old that is in soft sand. The legs of this little baby came up in the sieve, and we found this small individual, luckily, somehow, in the excavation square. This little baby is lying on their left side with their right arm out and their left arm bent. And because baby skulls are not fused, their heads are always flat. All the bones collapse on top of each other. On the lower left is a skull, but without any postcranial remains from Pine Haka. And that's all we found was a head floating, and there was a small hole, a grave cut around the head, so there was no body there before. Here's another, in the center is another example of two burials from Pinehaka that were actually buried close, but buried one on top of the other, but didn't disturb one another. And here we have that burial 22 that was on the first slide. And this person was buried with a small, beautiful adze, stone adze in their hand. So it was actually placed in their hand. And here we have a burial that I excavated from Papua New Guinea. And this person was flexed. And then during decomposition, they had fallen in on top of themselves. So they were in a round pit like this. And this excavation was interesting because the burials were at the water table. So there was only a certain amount of time during the day that we could excavate before the tide came in and the water table raised, and it was impossible to excavate. You can see the water in that grave. So photos are very important, and you don't really know how good they are until you get back home. So it's really important to either be in all sun or all shade. And this shows an example on the right is the same burials in sun and shade, and then totally covered in shade. And you can see how much clearer it is when there is just complete shade. Also, it can be really good to have a square like this that you place over the burials and take a photo. So when you're trying to draw them on the map later, you know exactly where the skeleton is on each meter square for your excavation. And always remember to take pictures with a scale and a north arrow. This will help you later on being able to orient where the skeletons are in the excavation. And also it tells you about burial ritual, because if people are buried east-west or north-south, this can tell you about their culture in the past. Also, take a photograph of the whole burial and small parts of it. You can never take too many photographs. And again, take more specific photos of pathology or cut marks, either in the grave, and then I do it again after. I bring a photo box onto the site. Now the burials can be drawn on the computer or on site. And the benefit of drawing on site is that you can really draw each bone the way that you see it. Sometimes photographs aren't that clear. And when you can identify each bone and then draw it, this can be really helpful for the interpretation later. You can also label the bones in the field. Now, human bone recording, we use the burial recording form. I can give you a PDF. I think I've given these to Kiki, but I can give them to you again. We use these field recording forms. It's important to measure the depth of each of the major parts of the skeleton. And these skeletal recording forms show the bone condition, where you document the bone condition, the completeness, the articulation, in situ estimates or determination of age, sex, long bone lengths that tell you about stature. And it's very important to record these in the field, because the bones might break and you may never be able to get those measurements again. And you can also record if you have done any DNA sampling, isotope sampling, and then you have a record right away of what you have on hand and what's clean, dried, and packed. So lifting is very important because this is the point where you're going to be able to protect the bones. And it's important to uncover as much of the bone as you can, create a little pedestal, and then cut underneath and lift the bones out. I always lift systematically from usually the hands and feet first, so I don't lose any bones, and then go up the limbs and leave the head for last. Sometimes you need to lift in blocks. So this could be in the thorax. If this is kind of concreted together or very crumbly, you can lift it as a big block and then deal with it in the lab. And while you're lifting, you want to take notes and photographs of, because this can tell you about how the body is positioned, which will tell you about the burial practice. So these are some examples. On the right here, this is how I would lift a foot. So you do the one on top, systematically take one off, and then you can see the position of the lower foot. And I'll remove all the ribs, limbs, and then leave the spine for last. And then you can see exactly how the person is positioned in the grave and the shape of the grave underneath, especially if they're not in a coffin. And this is an example of lifting around the pelvis. And if you do it carefully, you can also record the auricular surface and the pubic symphysis, which will be used for age estimation and also for the pubic symphysis, the sex estimation. So here you will lift the sacrum and then you'll have the auricular surface available. And sampling for other research is really important in the field. For DNA, you want to do this as clean as possible. Usually the petrous bone, so this is inside of the skull, inside the ear. Isotopes for diet and migration. And I find that sampling the first molar and the third molar is a good idea for all these different types of analyses. Canculus is calcified plaque on the teeth, and to sample the whole tooth is really good and put it in a bag, and then this can be microscopically analyzed. Also, from the bottom of the pelvis, the lowest part, kind of by the sacrum, you can take a soil sample, and this can be analyzed for certain pathogens or parasites. And then for ancient DNA, it's always good to do this as clean as possible so you don't get your own DNA in there. And then it's important to really, if you can on site, gently wash and dry the bones in the shade. This is a good example of being in the shade. And put back in the original bags with labels on them, very important. Pack and bubble wrap. And this is if you can take the bones away, and pack in plastic sturdy boxes. You can never label too much. In the post-excavation analysis, this is what happens in the lab. Age and sex estimates, macroscopic analyses for trauma or pathology. You can also do microscopic analyses for histology, then more photographs, of course. And then curation. This is an example of someone doing seriation. So they've put a little label on each bone, and then they're seriating them to look at musculoskeletal markers. And it's important in the lab, you unpack the bones, put them in different labeled boxes that aren't for moving. Usually I keep one burial in one box. Just keep organized, keep everything labeled, and keep in a cool, dry place. And this is when you send the samples for analysis and do some more in laboratory analysis. And I think, I'm just a few minutes early. Yes, thank you to Professor Tutikos-Bardiati for inviting me, and Kiki for moderating and organizing, and Bayu for also organizing too. Do you have any questions?
Okay, Becca, thank you so much. That's really enlightening us, especially the participant who works in forensic aspect or bioarchaeology. That's really, and also pathologists. It's really interesting. But first of all, I'd like to wrap it up in Bahasa first, so you can sit back, relax, and we'll come. Okay.
Minum dulu.
You can take a drink. Baik, saya akan membacakan sedikit resume dari pemaparan Dr. Rebecca Kynaston tadi. Sudah kita dengar 90 menit, kurang, 80 menit kira-kira tadi ini. Jadi memang Dr. Rebecca ini sudah sering untuk menjalin kerjasama bersama UNER, yang mana tahun 2019 kami sudah bekerja sama di Mystery Cave tadi sudah dijelaskan, berkolaborasi selain dengan UNER juga dengan Balar Jogja, kemudian juga dengan Griffith University. Lalu dari pemaparan hari ini mengenai burial practice sendiri, didapatkan informasi yang luar biasa tentang kehidupan di masa lampau bisa diketahui melalui burial practice itu sendiri. Jadi selain tradisi, kemudian kita juga bisa mengetahui tentang status sosial dari si individu tersebut, kemudian juga pola migrasi, lalu juga mungkin pernikahan, kemudian beberapa peninggalan yang ada di makam tersebut seperti perhiasan, gelang yang tadi sudah dicontohkan oleh Rebecca. Kemudian juga burial practice sendiri memang sangat berhubungan erat dengan proses taponomi, kemudian juga proses dekompos, sudah dijelaskan juga tadi beberapa tahapan-tahapan atau proses dekompos sendiri, lalu juga mengenai bone preservation, yang mana faktor-faktor eksternal dan juga internalnya itu sangat bervariasi ya. Jadi mulai dari area sekitar dari penguburan itu seperti apa kondisinya, itu bisa mempengaruhi kondisi si mayat itu sendiri. Kemudian adanya pertumbuhan bakteri atau fungi yang ada di sekitar mayat itu juga bisa mempengaruhi kecepatan atau proses pembusukan di sekitar area. Kemudian juga tentang primary dan secondary burial. Tadi juga sudah dicontohkan dengan gambar-gambar dan kasus yang menarik. Beberapa saya catat di sini seperti burial di coffin, di peti, kemudian juga multiple burial, lalu jar burial, lalu juga ada manipulasi posisi ketika penguburan. Tadi beberapa foto yang diberikan oleh Rebecca menunjukkan posisi kubur yang menarik gitu di masing-masing contoh. Lalu juga ada mengenai beberapa studi yang sudah dijelaskan, studi di PNHK, kemudian di Lapita, di Vanuatu. Kemudian yang terakhir tadi dijelaskan oleh Dr. Rebecca, yang mana tentang protokol ekskavasi, apa-apa saja yang sepatutnya dilakukan di lapangan ketika melakukan ekskavasi. Seperti itu. Kemudian saya akan membuka diskusi ini. Jadi monggo, so let's start our discussion session. Who's gonna be the first questioner? Okay. Masih sepi, sepertinya masih mengilhami proses. Oh ya, mungkin bisa disampaikan dulu dalam bahasa Indonesia, kemudian kami bantu untuk translate. Silakan.
Hello.
So we already got our first questioner.
Hello, good afternoon.
Ade Sukana.
Yeah, hello. My name is Made from Udayana University. Such a great presentation, Dr. Rebecca.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a few questions. The first one is I'm interested with the burial practice and the use of plant, especially the herbs. As I know, we are in Bali. We use many plant herbs, especially, for example, masoya, yeah, masoya, and also many leaf and local plants that we use during the burial practice. I would like to know if you have the data or findings that the use of herbs worldwide, especially in the Southeast Asia or Pacific area. And the second one, I have a question about the difference between the male and female, or woman or man, burial practice in several countries or islands in Pacific, Asia Pacific. Yeah. And then the third one, did you find any difficulties when you do what we call it excavation during the archaeological process for the king's family? If you have an experience to do research and then to get uh, the dead body from the palace family or for the king family. That's all the question. Thank you, Dr. Rebecca and the moderator, Ms. Rizky.
Thank you. Was the first question about the use of plants for the burial practices?
Yes, the plants or herbs in the ancient time. If you find, yeah.
We don't have. There's no there's no evidence. I'm sure that they were using plants, but we just don't have any archaeological evidence of it. And I think what we need to do is like flotation for that to see if there's any type of like microparticles. And I think that would be a good thing to do soil samples and then flotation later for that would be, it is an excellent question and a good idea. I think because I know, yeah, and in Vanuatu, the plants are very important for burial ritual, but we haven't had any archaeological evidence of them because they've degraded, but there might be microparticles of that that we can find. The differences between male and female, there doesn't seem to be any obvious differences. In Pine Haka, everyone was buried differently. So it was really hard, like there was no kind of common thread or common differences between males and females because everyone had a different burial. So that was very weird. And in Teuma, everyone's head was gone, black. Yeah. So, but the skulls that we did find were both male and female. So yeah, not really sure. And the last question, can you clarify that one a little? Oh.
Bapak Madi, mohon maaf, mic-nya masih mute.
Okay, the last question, maybe if you have any experience about the maybe legal aspect when you do, when you get the data from, for example, the king family, as I know, as I assume that maybe especially in the Asian countries, in the Southeast Asia, maybe you can get the fact, more fact if you do excavation for the family, for the king family, but maybe if you find any difficulties for the like the permit to get the license to take the take the data. Thank you.
That good question. I'm a foreign researcher. This is why I work closely with Professor Kois Bardiadi, and we put in the research as a collaboration, as a collaborative project, and I have to get special like a research visa to come to do the work, and yeah, we just go through the full process through Ristech and Puslet. And most of the samples, they don't leave the country. So the samples that we use for dating or isotope analyses will get approval from Puslet to get them sent out of the country. So it's definitely a long process, but I think we're all learning how to do it. Now I think this is the third research permit. So yeah, it's becoming smoother. Yeah.
Thank you, Ibu Rebecca and Ibu Rizky.
Terima kasih.
Okay, Becca, I got one question through DM here. This one from Muhammad Hafdal. He's kind of wondering how the exact method to clarify this one is a primary burial and this one is a secondary burial on the coffin and also on the jar case.
So that primary burial, it's all about the articulation of the bones. So if you know the person is in, like the bones are in anatomical position and they're attached, that is how you can say this is a primary burial. Where a secondary burial, you will have just bones that don't match up together in a pile, or there might be too many people, more than one individual in an area. So really it's about the position of the bones and if they're in anatomical position, and that's how we can tell the difference between the primary and the secondary.
Baik, bagaimana Muhammad Afdal? Mungkin ada yang disampaikan lagi ke Rebecca?
Again?
Wait a minute. Afdal? Oh, okay. Okay, so it's clear.
Okay.
So, any questions? Another questions?
Hi, may I ask a question?
Oh yeah, finally, yay!
Okay.
Great.
Thank you for the opportunity. I have these questions like bugging in my mind about the secondary and primary burial.
Yeah.
As we know that when the disease or when the skeleton is being moved from their primary burial, they will probably they have some sign that we can catch on, like, oh, the skeleton has moved or something like that. How to differentiate that those skeletons being moved to the secondary burial or the secondary location if they are not being buried by human intention for I don't know, for probably some culture or something like that, or for criminal or something like that, or it is being moved by animal predations or such as. How we can differentiate that? Thank you.
So if it's not being, like, if it's buried, then we know it's most likely, I mean, you can tell a human if it burial compared to like an animal one because it will be shallow. But I think looking for any bite marks or gnaw marks on the bone will be your number one identifier. So that's why it's really important to, you know, like an archaeology is like the crime scene, and you might be talking about forensically how to differentiate. So if you're seeing something like bones, human bones that aren't buried, then definitely photograph them as you first find them. And then when you're in the laboratory looking for analyzing them more in depth, really looking for any type of bite or gnaw marks on it, because the animal will definitely leave those behind, depending, you know, on the state of the body or how decomposed it was, or the bones when they're being moved. But regardless if it's soft tissue, they're probably going to gnaw on the bones and leave a sign on the skeleton. And I think also looking at the selection of bones, where if you see really nice organized, like a bundle, then that's probably going to be a human moderated situation, where an animal is going to grab and tear off certain limbs, or and it will have a different what do I want to say, like pattern of what limbs are chosen, but definitely looking for any bite marks or gnaw marks would be my answer there.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
Okay, Vika. Actually, I have a question for you. Is that okay, Ibu Tuti? Moderator itself has a question.
Ask.
Okay. All of us in the world has been dealing with the COVID things in past years. And what do you think in the future about the all process about the COVID burial things, wrap it in the plastic and then wrap it in the body bag and put it in the coffin? And how do you think about the body preservation?
Well, I've had experience excavating people that had been buried in plastic from the 1950s. And what happens is, because there's no oxygen in there, so anaerobic bacteria are acting as the decomposition. So it turns into the adipocere. So basically, like, there's the fatty, waxy material and bones is still in there. That's what's going to happen. So I think they're probably going to be very well preserved in the future people to find.
So maybe like a fully skeleton is gonna take like 10 years or maybe more?
Oh, I don't know. So that really depends on lots of different factors, like heat, moisture, how strong the coffin is, if there's water getting into the coffin, and moving around. But the bacteria in the people is gonna start decomposing them, even if there's no external bacteria. So they decompose, but then all the adipocere is still in there, for the adipose tissue that turns into adipocere. Yeah, it's all there.
Okay, Vika, thank you. Okay, Avika. Oh, this one. I think this one is gonna be our last questions. This one from Yudi, Dr. Yudi. Hello, Doc. Do you have any data about how long embodied body by formaldehyde could be?
Formaldehyde. Now.
Okay, it's gone. Oh, could be still exist?
Ooh, I think that it would probably. I don't have any data. I can't answer that question. I'm sorry. But that is an interesting question. I'm just used to mostly archaeological things, but yeah, I think that's for future. Yeah, I can't answer that. I'm sorry. And then we have
Yeah.
next is
More question, Faiza.
Is Sally. Hi, Sally. I know Sally. I think it's the same Sally. Oh, so for the isotope analysis, it just needs to have collagen in the bone. So this needs to, yeah, most skeletons will be okay for isotope analysis of the bone. And for the teeth, usually teeth are so well preserved that we can do the isotope analysis on that. Yeah. So, so there's not very many essential requirements. Basically, the bone just can't be fossilized, or to the point where there's no organic matter left, because yeah, it's taken on too much of the minerals from the soil, and it's not the human signal anymore. Yes, Yuri, that is for the people that are doing modern research, I feel like you could do some type of experimental animal study on that formaldehyde, because I feel like that could be important for forensics.
And we got another question from Bapak Made.
Woo!
That's a tough one, long one.
Okay, so in the Pacific, I know one of the earliest cremations we found was actually at Tayuma. There's a cremation there, and that's 3,000 years ago. At the other sites, there aren't that many Austronesian burial grounds to investigate that are that old or that are 3,000 years old. So it's very difficult to discuss because there's just a lack of data because we don't have the samples. So yeah, it is. We definitely didn't have any cremations at Pine Haka. And the other early sites, the Austronesian sites like Malolo, they were excavated in the 1950s. And Tuti will be able to give you any more information on that. But I know, Tuti, do you know of any cremation at Neolithic?
Apa yang kita ngomong bahasa Indonesia? Becca, let me set in bahasa, oke?
Silakan.
Pak Made, itu ada kasus juga di Majapahit ya yang tidak dikremasi. Jadi waktu itu asumsi kita adalah bahwa rangka ini yang didating sekitar abad 14 itu tidak dikremasi. Jadi kita juga tidak tahu ada informasi kapan kremasi itu dimulai. Artinya kalau misalnya kita berbicara tentang macam-macam Hindu, itu berarti pada waktu, kalau ini informasinya yang lain ya, dan ini interpretasi yang lain ya, berarti pada masa Majapahit itu tidak ada kremasi atau belum ada kremasi, atau itu adalah aliran yang lain dari Hindu yang tidak dikremasi. Waktu itu saya konsultasikan dengan seorang arkeolog dari India, mereka bilang, oh berarti kremasi tidak harus pada semua orang Hindu gitu. Jadi kalau yang pandita dan sebagainya itu tidak perlu dikremasi. Jadi informasi ini pun belum terlalu jelas dan saya juga tidak menemukan informasi tentang kremasi mulai kapan ada di Indonesia atau Asia Pasifik gitu ya. Itu Becca.
Makasih Bu Tuti.
Nggih.
Makasih Bu Becca nggih.
Very interesting.
Okay, is there still any questions?
Becca, I mean, we don't have any information about cremation in Asia Pacific. We found actually a skeleton in Majapahit Kingdom, but we don't know, and I'm not sure that there was a cremation.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was 14th century, but we don't have any evidence for cremation.
Earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, doesn't mean it won't be found, but we just don't have it now.
It depends on belief system also.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We'll see.
Okay. Alright. Baik, kalau sudah tidak ada lagi yang bertanya, maybe we can close this webinar. It's already nearly 7 p.m. ya in New Zealand, Becca.
Oh no, it's near 6.
Oh, 6. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
Fine.
sorry.
No problem. Tidak apa-apa.
You still remember your bahasa? Good one.
Oh, my poor bahasa.
Becca, waktunya makan.
Thank you so much for all the participants. Terima kasih banyak sudah mau join bergabung dengan kami hari ini pada webinar tentang burial practice. Terima kasih banyak dan kami juga berharap untuk bisa join ke depannya lagi untuk tiga sesi lagi. Kami masih memiliki 3 sesi webinar series setiap hari Kamis. Kemudian untuk sesi selanjutnya malam hari. Jadi sesuai dengan nama dari webinar kami yaitu Night at the Museum. Jadi spesial untuk hari ini Day at the Museum, tapi ya sudahlah, tidak apa-apa. Jadi terima kasih banyak sudah hadir. Thank you so much Becca. Thank you.
Terima kasih
Terima
banyak.
kasih Becca.
Thank you, Becca.
Terima kasih.
Thank you,
Terima
Rebecca.
kasih.
Oke, takut.
Terima kasih Bu Tuti.
Bye.
Iya.
To meet you,
Bye-bye.
Rebecca. Thank you.
Oke, nggak apa-apa.
Dengar ya.
Terima kasih, Buto.
Monggo, silakan.
Matur nuwun Buto.
Ya.
Terima kasih Bu Tuti.
Kakek tadi.